Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for coming to the Psychiatry Grand Rounds today. Today we'll be hearing from Professor Mell, who is a trained social, personality, and health psychologist. He joined the faculty of the psychology department here at U of A in 2004, where he's now a tenured associate professor. He's also an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Communication, an associate investigator at the Arizona Cancer Center, and an affiliate faculty at the Evelyn McKnight Brain Institute. Over the last decade, Dr. Mell has developed the electronically activated recorder, or EAR, as a novel methodology for unobtrusive naturalistic observation of daily life. He has repeatedly written about and given workshops on novel real-world assessment methods, and most recently edited the Handbook of Research Methods for Studying Daily Life. His research has been published in multiple high-impact journals, including Science, Psychological Science, the Annual Review of Psychology, Psychological Assessment, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and Health Psychology. It has been funded by various groups at the National Institute of Mental Health, the American Cancer Society, and the John Templeton Foundation. Dr. Mell is currently Vice President of the Society for Ambulatory Assessment and serves on the board of the Association of Research and Personality. And in 2011, the Association for Psychological Science identified him as a rising star in the field. Today we'll be hearing about his work on psychological analysis on daily conversations in breast cancer patients and their partners. Thank you, Dr. Mell.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I believe I remember I was here, it was probably 3 years ago, and gave a Psychiatry Grand Rounds talk, and I compared the two sets of slides, and I was happy to see that there was actually literally no other overlap than the background color of the slides. So it is, science is, or at least the research we're doing is moving slowly forward, and I have new material to present. I originally intended to give this presentation with my senior doctoral student, Megan Robbins. I was expecting that after about half an hour you would get tired of hearing me, and then I can bring in a new person and you can hear her speak. Megan is really the backbone of the study that I'm going to talk about today, our Couples Coping with Breast Cancer project. She ran almost all of the participants and knows the study in and out. However, it so happens that she has to turn in her dissertation in 2 days, and so she decided that it would be better for her, or we decided that it would be better for her mental health to work on the dissertation. I wanted to open this talk with what I perceive to be an imbalance in psychosomatic research, or you could also call it a blind spot. And it's really something that I gradually realized. It took me a while to see it in that clarity, but I think it's an important imbalance or an important blind spot. And it kind of goes like this. So two researchers meet at a conference and say, hey, what kind of research are you up to these days? Well, I'm doing a study on the psychosocial influences on health, and then the other researcher, oh, that's really interesting. So what kind of health biomarkers do you have? And so this is actually a real case that has happened at a conference. And so you can, I mean, if you're in the lucky situation that you have biomarkers, you can say, oh wow, no, I'm assessing inflammatory markers, I'm measuring other immune markers, hormonal things, I'm doing a brain study, I measure glucose levels and all those things, and you can get the researcher really excited. If you take if you take the other route and you say, hey, I'm doing a study on the psychosocial processes in health, so what kind of psychosocial variables do you have? How do you measure social processes? You typically don't get the same degree of enthusiasm. So what I think to me is very interesting is that we have a degree of sophistication in the measurement of what people typically would call a dependent variable, those health outcomes, that we can measure a host of processes with a degree of sophistication that is really enormous and that is really impressive. But then we kind of forget that we can only really get very robust and very good research findings if we take the same degree of sophistication on the other side of the equation, on the measurement of the predictors of those psychosocial processes. But there, typically, researchers administer questionnaires, so it would be perfectly okay to give an optimism questionnaire and say, how does optimism predict inflammatory markers? How does social support, how is it related with arterial thickness or recovery after a little skin scratching that people produce, so skin recovery. And the imbalance that I see is that we are very multi-method focused on the dependent variable side and rather mono-method focused, questionnaire focused on the independent variable side. And this can be problematic. And that's what I think I would like to talk about today. So when you look at the way you can measure psychosocial processes, you can organize these methods in a very simple way by putting out a 2x2 method matrix. Again, this is just for the psychosocial measures, so physiological measures are not included. But you can ask, are the measures or are those variables, do you collect the data using self-report or behavioral observation, or do you collect the data in the laboratory or in the natural environment? So most of the time, researchers collect the data in the laboratory using self-report questionnaires. There is a big literature on the limitations of those methodologies, and this is why researchers in different areas, among them relationship research, developmental research, child research, family research, have supplemented those questionnaires with behavioral observation. So you bring children in the lab, you bring families in the lab, and you observe them. And you do that because you believe that there's things that you cannot get at with self-report, and that you would have a better observation would provide better access to. It was in the late 70s and early 80s that researchers realized that the laboratory can impose pretty serious constraints onto what you can study and what you can find. So you only get certain behavior, you have impression management, you have demand characteristics, all of those effects. And that primed those researchers to say, hey, we cannot only bring the participants to the lab, we also need to begin to bring the lab to participants. We need to collect science where science really happens, which is in people's daily lives. And that was when Csikszentmihalyi developed the experience sampling method, and later on it became known as ecological momentary assessment, mostly in the medical field. There's other terms for it. You could call it ambulatory assessment. It doesn't matter. The idea is you assess, you try to collect data or information directly in people's natural environments. And the way it is typically done is you ask people questions in the moment. How are you feeling right now? What are you doing right now? And people used to do it with stacks of questionnaires. Now it is Palm Pilot. It used to be Palm Pilots. Now it's iPhones, and you just prompt them and people answer. Well, we see here that the lower right quadrant is actually underrepresented. Very little research has looked at naturalistic, at the behavioral observation in the natural environment. And that's interesting and kind of conspicuous because, at least in psychology, when you ask people what psychologists do, well, they observe people, right? And it turns out that that's actually what we do least often, at least compared to other surrounding fields such as anthropology, sociology. So I think we have a little bit of make-up work to do here. And that's what I've dedicated most of my research career so far to. And what we have developed is a methodology that allows us to naturalistically observe people in their everyday environments. And because it makes a beautiful acronym, we decided to call it the EAR, the electronically activated recorder. But again, it doesn't matter how you call it. The idea is that you track people's daily behaviors from an observational perspective in the moment. The way we do it is by giving participants a tape recorder. And at the beginning, it really used to be an analog tape recorder, one of those dictation devices where we put 45-minute microtapes in, and then people had to flip it. And technology helped us, and we then switched to digital recording devices. There were timestamps, so there was a big progress. Then we went to Palm Pilots, or actually Pocket PCs, and most recently, we developed the iEar app, which you can freely download from iTunes. the idea, nothing has changed in terms of what the method does. You give participants a tape recorder, and they wear it during the daily activities, and it records periodically for short periods of time, and what we get is an acoustic log of a person's day as it naturally unfolds. In our studies, we mostly record 30-second sound bites, just short sound bites every 12 or so minutes. It gives us about 5 an hour. We think that's a good rate, but in the future we can think about whether we can adjust that. And that way we get about 70 to 90 sound bites. And to show you, or I could tell you, man, there's a lot of psychological information in there, but I think a better way to convey that to you is by showing you, in fact, what you hear in those sound files. So this is one sound file that I brought from my dissertation study in Austin, Texas.
Where are we at? Where are we going? Ruth. I live on Ruth Street. I would walk 500 miles and I would walk 500 more.
So what you see on this little clip, which is actually less than 30 seconds, you see there's a lot of information in this. So we already know the person is outside. You hear cars passing by. You hear the person is not alone. There's somebody else there. If you have the privileged insider knowledge of somebody who has lived in Austin, it's right next to a beautiful coffee shop where students are, but you don't really need to know that. But mostly the person is singing, and if I asked you right now, I think we would get a pretty good consensus that the person is in a good mood. So all of that is psychologically relevant information. But then you can ask, well, yeah, this is kind of the innocuous part of daily life. How about the real juicy things? I mean, do you get arguments, for example? Do you get the hot emotional stuff that happens? So I brought here a sound file that shows that we do capture emotional aspects of daily life.
That's why I thought it was okay. No, I didn't see Mom do it. I didn't see Mom do it. I said, Mom, should I set the cruise control at 80 all the way home? She's like, that's fine. And if she says anything different, it's a lie, because you don't ever test my memory. My memory is perfect.
Any memory researchers here? So I present this sound file because, well, obviously it's funny, but I think it also shows that the person talks pretty naturally. It seems like the person is not particularly influenced by the presence of the device, and that corresponds to the experience of many participants that we interviewed during the debriefing. It also corresponds to my own experiences, that initially when you get the device, there's a heightened degree of self-consciousness. You feel like, is this on right now? Is this going to be captured? Is that going to be captured? So you feel mildly uncomfortable. But then, you know, life's busy and life goes on, and you pretty quickly habituate to it. And that's when I believe we get fairly naturalistic data where, by and large, people don't self-censor and provide us with good information about those aspects of daily life that they can readily listen to. It's important that it's very important for this kind of research that you get the participant on your side. They really need to be with you. You need to convey to them why this is important. And for that it matters that you tell them, we have no interest in any embarrassing or in any private, intimate behavior. We only want to capture with the highest degree of precision those aspects of daily life that everybody could potentially witness. And to really convey that we also mean that, we provide participants with an opportunity to delete whatever sound files they want to have deleted. I think this is very important, that people feel they have the control. So they can review their sound files and say, Thursday afternoon, I want to see what happened there, and they can tell, I want the sound file to be deleted, no questions asked. It turns out hardly anybody does that. So in the study that I'm going to talk about today, we had a little over 100 participants, 28,000 sound files, and one single sound file was deleted. So it really is negligible, but I believe it's very important. So we have a pretty good sense that participants don't mind wearing the ear. And we also give them questionnaires and say, how much time were you wearing the ear? How much were you bothered by it? But because we're so notoriously skeptical of self-report, we wanted to have an unobtrusive measure of obtrusiveness, if you want so. And what we did was, for that, we coded simply how often participants were talking about the methodology in their daily interactions, with the assumption that the more they talk about it, the more it's on their mind and the more they're probably bothered by it. And when you do that, you see this beautiful habituation effect that very nicely corresponds to our own experiences, that for the first couple of hours, participants talk about it quite a bit, and after that, it comes up every once in a while in about 1% of the conversations. So what we can see is, and this corresponds to participant self-reports, that we have a methodology that participants feel comfortable with and that allows us to access those aspects of daily life that potentially other people could witness. So when you develop a methodology, what really is the ultimate test of a methodology is that you say, hey, there are things that we can do with this that we cannot do with other existing methodologies. And I could give an entire talk on that, and in fact I have given, that's usually the talks I give, I've given entire talks on that, but I'm going to cut that down to the gist, to the really important stuff, to then move on to these new findings that we have from our Couples Coping with Breast Cancer project, and those findings are really brand new. It's actually the first time that I will be talking about that, and they're still a bit in progress. So what is the added value of naturalistic observation with methodologies such as the EAR? And I will make the argument that naturalistic observation can provide ecological behavioral criteria that are independent of self-report, and that is important, that it very much matters for the kind of findings you get. And I'm going to talk about our Does Mars Equal Venus project, not much to do with astronomy. And the other argument I want to make is that naturalistic observation allows for the assessment of subtle or habitual social behaviors that evade self-reports. So you can study things that usually just fly underneath the radar of our self-perceptions. And then I'm going to talk a recent project that we did together, and where Karen Weiss was also involved, and Ana Maria Lopez, where we look at the health consequences of swearing, or the emotional consequences of swearing. So let's start with the first one. Naturalistic observation can provide ecological behavioral criteria that are independent of self-report. And if I did a little poll here, but I won't do that, I'm pretty sure that we could replicate the phenomenon that most people think that women are by a factor more talkative than men. So when we did the study, we polled different groups of people. We polled people in the US here, we polled people in Mexico, we polled people in Germany, we polled ourselves, and we found pretty good consistency in the assumption that women talk more than men. It seems like a fact. Luann Brizendine has published a book on the female brain, and in the book she says a woman uses about 20,000 words per day, while a man uses about 7,000 words per day. Importantly, all of that is hardwired into the brains of women. These are talents women are born with that many men, frankly, are not. I think talent is a kind of nice, elegant choice of word here. I should, in fairness, I should say she has taken out the numbers in the second edition. However, then I should also say she has in the meantime published a second book, and the second book is called The Male Brain. And I personally just wonder how you can write about the male brain when you've written about the female brain, other than just negating everything you said in the female brain, because the male brain doesn't really exist other than in comparison to the female brain, but apparently it warrants two different books. So 20,000 words a day for women, 7,000 for men, hardwired into the brain. I heard you have to have a brain image in a psychiatry grand rounds talk. Here's mine. Talk more, talk, talk, talk. It's right there next to the headache generator. Interestingly, Mark Lieberman, who is a linguist at the University of Pennsylvania and who has a wonderful blog called the Language Log, he wrote in this language log, "This morning I spent a fruitless hour trying to track down the source of Luann Brizendine's assertion that a woman uses about 20,000 words per day while a man uses about 7,000, but nowhere could I find any evidence that anyone has ever supported these assertions by actually counting words or measuring talking times." And this is when it gradually dawned on us that we had been counting words for quite a while. So we put all of our studies together. At that point, we had 6 ear studies with roughly 400 participants. We had collected more than 100,000 valid daytime sound files and a little less than 1 million words. And if you remember that we sampled 30 seconds every 12 minutes, that's 5% of a person's day, then it's very easy to extrapolate from the words that we've recorded to the words that a person should use. And it was pretty much really just an extrapolation from our word count, a little bit more sophisticated, but roughly that. And when you do that, well, you get a distribution. And the distribution you see is this. At first sight, I guess, not that much of a difference. And on some level, you could have expected that 20,000, 7,000 doesn't strike a scientist, a social scientist, like a reasonable effect size. That we don't get these beautifully large effects, that there's no overlapping distributions and 3 times as many words. But interestingly, and that came as a surprise to us as well, there was no difference whatsoever. In fact, when you look at it, the 3 most talkative individuals were all 3 men. In terms of the means, no difference in the means. We had 16,215 for women, 15,669 for men. Well, I was given a lecture, like somebody submitted, I've gotten many comments over email, and one person, in fact, submitted a comment to Science saying, you cannot say that there is no difference. Didn't you go to Stats 101? You cannot confirm a null effect. In fact, I think you find evidence for the fact that women do talk more 500 words. So we wrote a response to that, which was a nice opportunity to talk about power and effect sizes and things like that, but I didn't publish it. So yeah, we find that an average advantage for women with 500 words, which is trivial, absolutely trivial on the background of the between-person variability. So that's why we have effect size measure, Cohen's D, 0.07. What I really like about the study, you don't need significance testing. I mean, we did it anyway, and it was like 0.25. So, but what really fascinates me, and I'm also a personality researcher, so 500 words between gender difference. The least talkative individual in this study used 695 words, estimated. That's about an abstract in the morning, an abstract at lunch, and an abstract in the evening. The most talkative individual, so 695, the most talkative individual, 47,000 words. That's what I call a difference. That's what an effect is, right? And 500 words compared to that is truly nothing. Again, I think these are interesting numbers, but you probably find it also interesting to get a sound sample of our most talkative individual. So here, without further ado, our most talkative male in the sample.
They did it to make her mad, I think. Anyways. But that's just the kind of stuff that they do. I mean, her mom, it's like they're really nice. Like, some days they're like super nice and all loving and stuff, and then other days it's like, don't even go in that house. But anyways, so she didn't get to go, and she was really upset because she'd always wanted to go there. So I was planning on surprising her, and I made up a lie saying we were going somewhere else. And I was going to take her there, and then we got back.
And this is how it goes, sound file after sound file after sound file. Our poor transcribers. For reasons that I don't fully understand, the study evoked a lot of responses. So here, one person left an answering machine on my office phone, and I still have it on there, that said, this is the most disgusting, despicable research ever. I will call the university administration and make sure you don't get tenure. I am happy to say I'm beyond that, and I'm relieved. So here are a couple of responses from the Yahoo blog. What a bogus study. Not only do women talk more than men, they use 10 times as many words to get a point across. The second, slightly discouraging for scientists. Not buying it. You're never going to convince me that men talk as much as women on a daily basis. Whatever method they used for coming up with these results, at best they're flawed. This is horrible news. I hope that my wife doesn't read this because I'll never hear the last of it. I think that may get us a little closer to where those perceptions come from. And this is my absolute favorite. I want to recount. So what is interesting about the study is when you administer self-reports, and the Big 5 inventory, a personality questionnaire, has the item, I consider myself to be a talkative person. You very nicely, very reliably get a difference that favors women. Women report being more talkative than men. So even women themselves self-report that women are more talkative than men. And in the absence of any behavioral evidence, if our data holds in future studies. So I find this very interesting because you have a double dissociation between the behavior and the self-perception that would be interesting to scientifically explore where it comes from, but at the very least matters for the kind of variables we study. Sociability is something that researchers in health in the health world have extensively looked at. And I should tell you that in a different study, we did a cross-cultural study in Monterrey, Mexico, and in the US, and you find very robustly that Americans report being more extroverted, more sociable, and more talkative than Mexicans. Yes, Americans report being more extroverted, sociable, and talkative than Mexicans. We replicated that in our study, but we found that in terms of the amount of time spent in extroverted, sociable, and talkative behaviors, Mexicans outweigh or outperform Americans. In fact, Americans reported being significantly more talkative, whereas Mexicans talked 9% more of the time. So again, the method will have an effect on the kind of findings you get. And it's interesting why, but we can't get into that now, but that I think we have established. So in addition to one needing an independent criteria, it's independent of self-report, naturalistic observation also can get you those subtle aspects of social life that pass by in our lives without us hardly noticing them, at least not consciously. So there I will talk about a project that got recently published in House Psychology that we did in collaboration with Karen and several other people. And again, it was spearheaded by Megan Robbins and another doctoral student in my lab. It's pretty uncontroversial to say that swearing is a ubiquitous behavior. Apparently the Arizona legislator even wants to get it out of the classroom, but that's a different story. So it is everywhere, apparently even in the classroom. And it's probably not far-fetched to say that it may play a role in the coping process. But when you look at the literature, very few studies have looked at swearing in the context of coping. And most recently, there was one study that got a lot of media attention by Stevens, and it's a fascinating study. They looked at swearing and coping with pain. And they asked participants to put their hands in ice water and leave it in there until they can't stand it anymore, the cold pressure task. And so participants had to do that twice, once in the control condition without doing anything special, and once reciting a number of swear words. And what they found was that when participants were swearing, they were able to put their hand in ice water for about a minute longer. So swearing supposedly helps with coping with arthritis, and there may even be physiological pathways. It activates this fight-flight response and therefore creates a heightened pain threshold. So it's really fascinating. That's just about the only study that we found out there. But then we're social psychologists, so we wondered, well, in addition to these intrapersonal consequences, are there interpersonal consequences to swearing? And what are the consequences of these interpersonal consequences? And our prediction was that independent of these potential benefits that you may have intrapersonally, that swearing could have interpersonal consequences and may be perceived as socially repellent. It may push your social network away and thereby undermine emotional support, and by undermining emotional support lead to possibly a downstream increase in risk for depression, because we know that emotional support buffers against the development of depression. So we took data from two pilot studies, and one was a pilot study on coping with arthritis that we did in collaboration with Shelley Castle at the Arthritis Center. The other one was our pilot study of 21 breast cancer patients that was funded by an American Cancer Society, actually an institutional research grant from the Cancer Center. And those 21 are also included in the final sample. It's a little awkward, but so we took those two pilot studies and put them together. And participants also completed an emotional support questionnaire and completed a depression questionnaire at baseline and at follow-up. So we then took all those recorded sound files. Participants were wearing the device in one study for 1 week and in one for 2. They were very similar in design. We transcribed all of that, and we extracted the frequency with which participants used swear words. We did that using automatic text analysis, but if there's a question, I can answer that. And in addition to that, we wanted to know how often the person was swearing alone versus with other people, because obviously it's meant to matter if we're arguing that there are social consequences. So therefore, it should only matter when people are with others. What we found was pretty interesting and pretty consistent. So we found that swearing correlated negatively with changes in emotional support. So the more participants were swearing, the less they reported having emotional support. At the same time, the more participants were swearing, the more they were on an upward trajectory to depression, the more they changed positively over time in the number of depressive symptoms. And this held controlling for different markers of disease severity, because of course people who are doing worse may swear more because they're doing worse, and so we wanted to control for that. The question, of course, is, so what happens when people swear in the presence of others versus alone? And we found that all of the effects were due only exclusively to swearing in the presence of others. Swearing alone was unrelated to changes in emotional support and changes in depression, and then you can do mediation analysis to get one step closer to a possible causality. And what we found was that swearing in the presence of others predicted changes in depression, and that was mediated by the changes in emotional support. So we conclude that swearing can undermine social support at the downstream expense of psychological adjustment. We mostly conclude, however, that we need more research. That we need more research on behavior that is apparently really important. And how can you do more research? You cannot give people a questionnaire and say, how much do you swear? So you need to kind of revert to behavioral observation. And so this is one argument, I think, that we need these other novel methodologies to study interesting effects that may not be captured by self-report. So to summarize, I think the value of the year for psychosocial health research lies in the fact that overall, wearing the ear is a pretty low burden for participants. They don't really have to do anything. They don't have to complete any questionnaires, and we find good tolerance. There is this aspect of self-awareness, but participants tolerate it pretty well. The measures we get are highly ecologically valid. That's the amount of words that people use on in a certain day, or the amount of swear words a person uses, or the time participants spend engaged in conversations with their partners. All very clear measures. You can focus on daily social behavior that tends to go under the radar of social perceptions. And the last, also relevant for people who are closer to practice, I believe that these concrete real-world measures more readily lend themselves to translation of research into practice. So if we find an effect on how much people talk about cancer or how often they talk about cancer to their partners, that's something you can tell people. You don't have to come up with a scientific definition of a construct. It's very clear. Everybody understands it. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to present findings from a study that we ran over the last 5 years, I believe. It's an extensive study. It's a really large-scale study that received generous support from the American Cancer Society, from the Cancer Center, and from the National Cancer Institute. And it's a study that I did in collaboration with Karen Weiss, who's Director of Psychosocial Oncology and here in Psychiatry, and with Ana Maria Lopez as the medical oncologist on the team from the Cancer Center. And again, Megan Robbins being the one who did, in fact, all the work, and so she went out. She spent most of her time at the Cancer Center and drove out to participants. So most of the credit really goes to her. This quote is taken from a meta-analysis that was published in 2008 about couples coping with cancer, and I think it really caught my attention. And there, Hagedorn and others argue that one fundamental key question that emerges is just how much cancer intrudes upon and organizes the lives of couples confronted with a disease. Direct sampling of their interactions and daily experiences could prove illuminating in this regard. So when you look at the effects of couple interaction, people typically bring participants in the lab. And this is a valuable strategy, but you can imagine that participants readily can talk about cancer if they are asked to. But do they naturally do that? How often do they naturally talk about cancer? So we can look at that. So from a theoretical perspective, I think when we do research on couples coping with cancer, we really need to adopt a systemic perspective. So we have the patient. Everybody knows that. Medical diagnosis and medical treatments don't happen in social isolation. So really what's happening is that the entire system is affected. So we have the patient and the partner who are affected. I'm not saying in the same ways, but are both being affected. And researchers call that dyadic, relationship-focused coping. And we focus on the verbally mediated part. But then that's really not all. In fact, both of them are embedded in larger social networks. So they talk to their family and their friends. And I guess you could call that larger communal coping. And the EAR methodology gives us an opportunity to track all of these interactions pretty efficiently with one device at the same time. So the study had two aims. They were very basic aims. The first aim was identify with whom and about what breast cancer patients and their partners talk in their daily interactions. You may notice this is not testing a sophisticated theory. It's very basic. How often do they talk about cancer? And we believe that's an important question to ask. And in fact, the oncologists that I talk to believe it's an important question to ask because nobody really knows how often cancer comes up in couples' daily conversations. The second aim then asks, okay, so there is a certain number of cancer conversations, there's variability between couples. How does that variability map onto adjustment to the treatment and the coping process? So we wanted to identify how differences in types and content of breast cancer patients and their partners' interactions relate to their psychological adjustment to breast cancer. Our original eligibility criteria, and I say original because we finally changed them slightly because we needed to get more participants, were the following. So breast cancer patients were eligible if they had a primary diagnosis of stage 0 through 3 breast cancer. We excluded metastatic breast cancer because presumably that's just very different issues to deal with. Actually, not presumably. And it needed to be, the patient needed to be post-definitive surgery and in adjuvant treatment, so either receiving radiation or chemotherapy or a combo. And couples, so we had eligibility criteria for patients and for couples. So couples were eligible if they were currently living together and both partners were speaking English in their daily conversations. We're not biased. We like other languages as much as we like English, but we needed to transcribe and code them, so it was really mostly practical concerns. I don't know why it always messes up the table, but so these are the participant characteristics. On average, they were about 56 years old with a wide range, 23 years married. We had apparently one couple that was 61, almost 62 years married, largely Caucasian, but we had 6 Latina couples. And so these are the patient characteristics, but we have the partners' characteristics as well, and they were mostly concordant. 2 African-American couples. In terms of the educational background, fairly evenly spread, and in terms of the stages, we had stage 0, we had most of the participants with stage 1, 2, and 3, and that's where we opened up. We finally did include 4 patients with metastatic breast cancer. We need to do a more careful analysis, but so far it looks like it may not change the effects in a dramatic way, and we badly need 4 degrees of freedom, but we'll see. Procedures, participants had definitive surgery. They met with a medical oncologist. That's when we contacted them. That's when Megan went to them, gave them a brochure, called them up down the road, or called them when they were back home, and got the consent from the partner and signed them up to the study. Participants then were in the study for 8 weeks, and there were 3 sessions. At session 1, usually on a Friday, and often coinciding with a meeting at the cancer center, they got a package of questionnaires which included demographic questionnaires, medical questionnaires, psychosocial adjustment questionnaires, and that's when we gave them the ear device. We activated, so would you mind wearing that until the end of the weekend, until Sunday night. After that, so session 2 was usually scheduled for either Monday or early after the weekend. We picked up the device. We got the sound files, and they completed a couple more questionnaires about compliance with the ear and how much they were bothered. And then 2 months later, we had the follow-up session where we administered the same set of questions that we administered at time 1. So we had the behavioral variables predicting time 2 or changes from time 1 to time 2 in those variables. Let's start with the first aim. So here we really want to know how much people talk, how much the couples talked about cancer versus about other topics. And so this is what we found, and to orient you, and I should emphasize, so these results are about 2 days old. I hope this is the final word spoken. There may be a couple of changes, but I wanted to present you the latest science. And so these are patients. So patients, they talked on average in about 48% of the sound files. It seems like we had really talkative couples here. Usually we see that our social life is constrained to about a third of our time. We spend a third of the time talking, two-thirds more in silence. Here they talk a lot, but it was also couples, older couples, over the weekend, so maybe that explains it. About 3/4 of the conversations that we captured were with a spouse, and about a third with family and friends. It doesn't have to add up to 100% because both can be present. And then the important part, how much did they talk about cancer? So we captured, and let me add we captured only 3.4% cancer conversations with a spouse for the patient, and the same amount, about 3% cancer conversations with the family. So this is 3% of the sound files. So if you divide that by roughly 2, you get to like 5 to 6% of conversations were about cancer for the patient. Pretty evenly. So what we can say is that patients talk about cancer about 5–6% of the time, and they bring the topic comes up about equally frequently with the spouse versus with friends and family. These are the data for the spouses. Again, a little bit less than half of the time talking. Again, about 3/4 of the time talking to the patient, and the rest to friends and family. And what we see is that spouses have about half the rate of talking about cancer. So that's probably consistent with what people would expect, that there is less conversations. What I find interesting is that indeed you have a pretty even cancer talk, evenly distributed cancer talk for patients, and you have cancer talk almost exclusively with the spouse for with the patient for the spouse. So patients talk to friends and family, and spouses almost, I mean, trying to be the support provider almost exclusively to the patients. This will become interesting when we later on look at the consequences, because we will later find that spouses talking about cancer to friends and family actually seems to map onto adjustment. What are the couple's cancer conversations about? So we have 5 or 6% of the conversations versus 2 or 3, but that's anything where cancer was in any way talked about. So this is not an existential conversation. This is not an emotional disclosure. This is everything. Whenever we could identify that this conversation was cancer relevant. We then devised a coding system where we split cancer talk into emotional disclosure, into supportive interactions where it was support given, and into what we call informational conversations. This is a substantive conversation about something related to cancer, but it's not emotional disclosure, and it's not support. And in practical conversations. Practical conversations is very easy. So when is your next appointment? Have you taken your medicine? All of those. So here are a couple of examples. I didn't bring the sound file, so I need to read that. Emotional disclosure, the patient says, there's definitely some crappy side effects, sorry for the swear word, and be careful, patient, that may backfire. There's definitely some crappy side effects, but you know, yeah, I mean, if it means I will be done with this and hopefully it won't come back, I'm fine, you know. So that's a typical core, like, textbook example of emotional disclosure. Supportive interactions, I think your hair looks cute, dearest. I noticed that it's changed, of course, but we'll go through and get past that. Don't worry about it. And if not, we'll live with it the way it is. Not a big deal. Obviously, not everything is that clear, but we do find those prototypes of social support. Informational conversation, again, this is talks about cancer, but they're not supportive, not meant to be primarily supportive, and not meant to be emotional disclosure. So the patient says, who know this person dies at 80 after a battle with breast cancer? That's not that old. Or the spouse says, they said she was at the cancer center, University of Arizona Cancer Center. She'd gone online and checked her out, so we knew she had a fellowship at a certain university. And finally, practical conversations, the patient says, because tomorrow I see the doctor, yes, the radiology doctor, and ooh, then the next day we go and have to talk about this stuff. So, I mean, this is natural language, so you have a lot of disfluencies and things like that in it. So what are couples cancer conversations then about? These are for the patients. We had about 6% cancer conversations, and here's, well, I actually did bring one sound file as an example of emotional disclosure. So if I have the time, wait, is it 5 that I need to be done? 5? Yeah, I think it's okay. So here's an example of emotional disclosure.
Get it cleaned up. Because I'm going to get well one of these days real soon, and I'm going to drive my car again. Go back to work.
So she says that she will go back to work. She reports hope and optimism. And here's support.
No, you don't do
nice.
hard manual work anymore. Not much, but oh yeah, you clean house. Clean house like a mad bandit. Especially since I've been sick.
That's a very nice compliment that she's making to the husband about contributing to the housework. Spouse, about 2.5% cancer talk. And again, what we see, so what me as a scientist actually is really interesting, those numbers, we need to interpret them. And there is no prior research. So it's as high, it's as low, it's very difficult. But I find it interesting. So trying to interpret it, I would say, well, it's probably expected that patients have more emotional disclosure than spouses. There's just more to disclose, I guess. I'm a little bit struck by the difference that there's so little emotional disclosure for spouses, but that was probably expected. What I didn't quite expect is that, I mean, you would expect that the patient maybe has more emotional disclosure, the spouse has more support. Well, it turns out that in addition to having more disclosure, the patients also have, let me add, the burden of, I mean, they feel like they also provide more social support. So I find that interesting. In addition to that, there's a good number of informational conversation going on and a good number of practical conversation. So these are the averages. Now we need to know how does variability map onto adjustment. And so that's the second aim. And here we use it. That's the statistics behind it. It doesn't matter. It's the active partner independence model. So here's one example. Cancer talk conversations within the couple. So we have the patient talking about cancer to the spouse talking about cancer to the patient, and we have depression, not changes in depression in this case, but just type 1 depression as the outcome, where we see the more patients and spouses talk about cancer, the more depressed the other person is. So it doesn't seem to influence their own depression, but it seems to kind of rub off at the partner's depression. Why? I'm not entirely certain about that. I would have better ideas if it predicted changes. It's just type 1 depression, but we can talk about that. Interestingly, that's, I think it's very interesting, cancer conversations with friends and family. So remember that patients had plenty of them. Spouses had very little, very few of them. But it is particularly the spouse talking about cancer with family and friends that is predictive of changes in the patient's perceived relationship satisfaction. And the more the spouse has these conversations, the more the patient increases in relationship satisfaction. And the more spouse has these conversations, the more the spouse, him or herself, increases in relationship satisfaction. So I find that's, for me, one of the highlights so far that we've found. And then you ought to look at emotional disclosure about cancer, and what you would expect maybe is that it kind of, the more they disclose, the better the adjustment over time. Story is always complicated, and there's more to this emotional disclosure than that part where you process things, and Annette Stanton has written very well about that, and other people have written about that. We did not find that patient emotional disclosure predicted changes in adjustment, and as a caveat, just as a little methodological side, and Annette Stanton actually writes that, you just don't have the nice help of possible item overlap between predictor and outcome that so often nicely helps you with actor effects. We just don't have that because one is behavioral observation, the other one is self-report. But what we did find was a partner effect. The more spouses used emotional disclosure, again, the more patients increased in dyadic adjustment over time. And so that kind of speaks to this communal coping and to the value for spouses also to open up, to provide support, and to disclose. This is what we have so far. So to summarize, naturalistic observation enriches coping research because it can focus on automatic behaviors. It doesn't suffer the problem of shared method variance between the independent variable and the predictor, and that's probably a little too methodological for this talk, but I think it's important. It produces ecologically valid findings that generalize to people's lives, and it focuses on concrete real-world behaviors. On the content side, we have found that cancer comes up in less than 10% of couples' conversations, so that makes 90% of the conversations not cancer relevant, which to me speaks a little bit about the normalcy behind those extraordinary times. And patients talk about twice as much about cancer compared to spouses. Patients equally disclose or talk about cancer to spouses and families, spouses predominantly to patients. Patients have surprisingly many support interactions, I believe, and spouse cancer talk, spouses bringing up cancer with their friends and family seems to have positive consequences for both members of the couple, at least with respect to adjustment. The big picture of that, we can skip over that pretty quickly. I'm interested in personality, social environment, and health, how social environments influence health, and how people select themselves differentially into social environments. And we have a number of projects going on that would fit in there. One is a study with Dr. Bootson and Dr. Sabara on adjustment to divorce, and 2 studies with Dr. Rezon, one where we try to change people's social environment sustainably in a way that would hopefully be conducive to better health. That's the compassion meditation study. And then the study they were about to study on inflammation and its effect on social behavior, or you could call it the psychoimmunology of personality. So these are the projects, but behind that, I think, to me, is just an interest in the everyday, mundane life that people live. And we have a way in our Sounds of Social Life project to provide almost an archive of daily life as it's naturally lived. So with that, I want to finish and thank, first and foremost, the participants that so readily shared their sound files with us, this incredible team of research assistants that over the years has coded and transcribed all those sound files, numerous people, mentors, colleagues, friends that have helped with that, and the different agencies that have provided funding. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and as you already should know, we think your research is wonderful here, so that's a given, hopefully. 2 questions I had was, what is the last study in the breast cancer patient study about gender difference, of course. If you look at breast cancer patients and male spouses, I'm sure you've thought a lot about this, and where, you found that in general study that women and men have the same amount of words that they're talking roughly over the day, but emotional disclosure is a whole different thing in terms of what those words are saying. And I'm just wondering, in the groups I run, I've got 9 women to 1 male. Generally, that's basically the ratio in those cancer groups. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of what that gender difference means here in those results you're getting. That's one question. The second part of the question was, is there a context? I mean, looking at things systemically is wonderful, but the context, for instance, in the swearing study, you're hearing them swear more, but we're losing a little bit of context of asking what they really meant. Was it coming from them, or were they swearing at somebody else? Or whatever? So those are
the second one I can add. The second question is, I'll start with the second question because it's actually easier. So for the swearing study, we looked at swearing at or swearing. Oh, yeah, okay. So the second question, which I will answer first, was the social context of some of the things we coded, particularly in the swearing study. Does the context in which you swear matters? I'm pretty sure it ultimately does matter. For example, I could see the effect going the other way if you look at swearing among the youth, among adolescents. It may actually create a bonding experience. So I'm also not sure that it's swearing that causes it or behaving in gender role inconsistent ways that causes this alienation from the social network. But to answer directly one question, we checked whether the effect was due to swearing at or swearing in the presence. So we had we coded this difference, and there was very little swearing at somebody, and so it was mostly just, it was actually fairly innocuous swear words. It wasn't particularly strong ones. but the context, it does matter. The first question is really interesting, and at the risk of coming across as inconsistent, I mean, there are gender differences at times, and so in our case, so our partners were not all men. They were predominantly men, but they were not all men. We had 7 same-sex couples out of 52, which is pretty much the rate. I think it represents the rate of breast cancer couples in the population. We haven't excluded the women, what happens to them, but some of that does sound like a little bit like emotional disclosure coming more readily to women, and men having a little bit of a harder time talking about cancer. So it smells a little bit like a gender differences that we have seen in the literature. So that will be it will be very interesting to explore that further. Mm-hmm.
In response to the question, what about men with breast cancer and their spouses?
It's a very good question. I'm proud to report, but I'm also then kind of sad to report. I'm proud to report that the very first participant in the sample was a male breast cancer patient, but we did ultimately exclude him because he would, I mean, it would introduce too much heterogeneity, I think, in the sample. But now that I say that, I wonder whether we actually, since given that we have same-sex partners, and I mean, we may as well just also add him again. So we only have one, but the prevalence of, what's the prevalence of breast cancer in men? 2%. Sorry? 2% of the cases. Okay. But we did have one. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your discussion of methodology and your apparatus in terms of your data collection and so forth. I'm rather intrigued, though, in terms of who listens to all these tapes, who gathers all this information. You have several assistants. I mean, I can't imagine the bulk of the information that you need to sort out through these recordings.
That is a great observation, and I have to say that many people get fascinated by the method and say, wow, so what else can you automatically extract from those sound files? And it is at the current time not automatic, it is manual. So we have a team of 10+ research assistants continuously working and coding and transcribing. I tell them, to motivate them, that they are really the ones who do the research, and in many ways it is actually true, and I think the cancer study is very indicative of that. So I went into this research thinking that the breast cancer conversations will come out, like 50% of the conversations will be about breast cancer. It was probably naive to assume. And I told the research assistants, if it gets intense, if it gets serious, there's the counseling center, you can come to me debriefing. I was really concerned about them listening to these sound files. And I have to say, we have 4 metastatic breast cancer patients. We have one couple where we had conversations that were touching, very touching. But by and large, it was the first research assistant came to me, he's like, had you not told me that these couples have breast cancer, I wouldn't have known. And I was like, well, it can happen once. But it happened twice, 3 times, 4 times, over and over again. So that really changed my mind of how to think about this project, that there's much more to coping with breast cancer than just talking about breast cancer. That's what I focused on today. There's these 90% of the conversations and the normalcy in that life that I think gets easily overlooked when you do coping research with coping questionnaires that specifically ask you about the coping experience. So they really play an important role, and I am very grateful, but yes, it is a lot of coding work. Mm-hmm.
Would you say the results would at least suggest that we could encourage men to be more engaged in talking about what they're going through or their situation in order to help these couples?
Give me a few more weeks that we do all the double checking of the numbers and dissertation is turned in and there's no error and nothing in there because that was kind of crammed last minute. But I'm mostly excited about it, and particularly about this discrepancy of it happening so little. And then, but it seems to matter. We couldn't. There's a lot of frustration also going on in this study. We couldn't predict changes in depression. Hardly ever. I mean, 25% were on antidepressants, so maybe, but we couldn't predict changes in physical symptoms. Mostly the effects really seem to happen on relationship satisfaction. So we didn't find many effects that we really thought would be there, and it's kind of surprising. But that one, I think, to me, makes a lot of sense.
Mark and I are happy to hear that because we have a group for men after spouses, and the men who come really seem to be very appreciative of it. So this would help us to encourage more.
I should also, as an anecdote that you probably have made the same experience, we had really good accrual rates in the study, but if somebody shut the study down, study participation, it was men. It was usually the women saying, hey, do you want to participate? And then usually, I don't think we want to. It's okay. And it's a sensitive study, so you need to wear that recorder, so I understand all of that. But it was usually the man. Or the women blaming it on the men. We don't know the full story behind that, but anyway. Mm-hmm.
Great presentation, very impressive application of the methodology. When you're thinking different to this particular study, as you're alluding to the fact that you were not finding a relationship with depression or the effects of depression, what are other variables within the EAR that you can measure that may be a proxy for depression? Volume, rate of speech, number of words, or emotional content, or are there other pieces you measure that correlate with depression?
We have a host of behaviors. We have expressed, in this study, in the Chuck study, we code affection, for example, expressed affection. We code many, many things, gratitude. In the breast cancer, we didn't, but we have support. We have different kinds, received support, given support, negative support, positive support. We have watching TV. We talk, this is the other thing. It just doesn't nothing comes out. We talk did not do much in this particular. In the other one, it did. Yeah. So I shouldn't let too much of my sadness let go out at this point. In the pilot data, we looked at it. We had an effect of partner housework. We code housework predicting patient depression. That seemed to have slipped away in the full data. Watching TV. Watching TV. That holds. I could go into why I would be very cautious to ever do an actor-partner model again. But without actor-partner, patient depression, patient TV watching predicts increases in depression. You put partner TV watching in there, and you start hating the actor-partner model because, to the extent that they watch TV together, it's actually part of that method, that overlap that gets taken out, and only unique portion predicts. So you actually then don't find that. So but TV watching, I think, is something that may come out.